У меня дочка на киевском рынке вдоль Киевской торгует киевским мясом. Я принес ей термос. Буквально через 2 минуты начался обстрел. Было 3 трупа лежало. Я сам видел. Перед киоском, здесь тротуар, стояло 2 машины. Вот, они были разрушены. Скоро уже все...
Да, алюминий, град.
Пятая школа.
So to explain you more, I will just show you the different map and why it's so special. You can see here that Mariupol is the second biggest city in Donetsk region in the eastern Ukraine after Donetsk and Luhansk, and this is a major and very important port which is on the road to Crimea, and there is just 50 kilometers from the Russian border. It was in the end of August, then there were both separatists and the Russian troops came into the city of Novoazovsk on the Russian border, and it was like an opening of the third front. Since then, for the 4 months, there were constantly some anxiety and anticipation there would be a major attack on this big town, which is under the Ukrainian government controls. So what happened this day, what happened yesterday was probably something which everybody was concerned, but people were thought, you know, it was a sign of the start of the escalation or of a new something new.
It came earlier than a lot of people expected. People had thought there'd be a new offensive in the spring, but I don't think, you know, even though the threat was always there since, you know, we've seen this border moving forwards or just the front, but no one really expected it to strike when it did.
And we just trying to call our colleagues who work there at the moment. They arrived to the city as soon as knew about the tragedy which had happened. So we're calling to the English journalist Philip Warwick, who is a photojournalist and spent the last day and night driving around and with our colleagues from Hromadske talking to the people on the ground. So I'm looking forward. We have not the best connection. It happens often. So we'll call him on telephone and we'll talk to. I wonder if we have him already on the phone. But I think that what else we can also add that what's happening now in Ukraine, it's still like a lot of shock. We had today the meeting of the Security Council where more or less it was stated by the Ukrainian president that it's not the end of the ceasefire, but like the separatists, which they've been in the contact group together with OSCE and with the Ukrainian side, with the Russian side, that it's more or less their withdrawal from this.
Well, I mean, I think it's, you know, seen as a game changer insofar as that people see that it can't continue the way it's been continuing. You know, talking about the Minsk agreements and what can be done there. You know, once you have this active hostilities, not just in Mariupol, but part of what we're trying to look at is the Baltsova and then also the Donetsk airport. There's been a lot of activity recently.
But before we start, I maybe like draw your attention again to this map. Then you would really see that how close the Russian border is, and this is the territory where more or less here in between there is not a real clear line where in this area there are the like pro-Russian separatists controlling the territory, and more or less the Ukrainian troops here. It's not very clear, but it's more or less enough to use all these Grad rockets because that's how it works, that you can have like around 20 kilometers. That's how long they can fire and reach the...
Well, now on the line we have Philip Warwick, who's a photojournalist who is near Mariupol and was in the city after the attack. attacks. Philip, what was the mood on the ground there in Mariupol when you arrived?
Well, yesterday when we arrived, there weren't actually too many people. Majority of them in the morning had a big club. Only the evening that you were saying after had a low tool was actually given from the chief of police. And there was still a trickle of more people coming back, and it's encouraging as the situation in the city was under control.
And what did the damage look like? I mean, how would you assess that? There's been a lot of images circling on the internet, but sometimes those can be overblown.
I would say that was actually an accurate assessment of actually what we saw is what actually happened. The market, the open market, and the surrounding residential area, that was indeed peppered by bread and hurricanes. So most of all, the grad shelling, shrapnel, clear evidence of that in the area. Building damage, vehicles damage, property damage, and even grad in the road, the one landed in the middle of a football pitch in the residential area. And of course, besides the large residential block there, an area of the area where you have to go private houses, and some of them were actually completely destroyed by the tanks themselves. Some were left unscathed, but others were burned.
Mm-hmm. And from the people that you spoke to or interacted with, what do they think the next step will be? What are they expecting now?
Are we talking about the local authorities, or we're talking about the local population?
Mm-hmm.
Hello?
Yeah, I think that that's what we hear. This is places where it's not easy to get the perfect connection at the right time. But thanks a lot, Philip, for your contribution. I would also put your attention, draw your attention to this. Let's say, that was something. We wanted to show the map of, and I asked the team to help us to show the map, which was proliferated by the Human Rights Watch, where they showed where there was actually these attacks, this grad hit the area. So maybe I'll also do that. That will give a bit more impression to.
Well, I think of both the scale and the direction that they're coming in.
Yep, but that it's not. At the same time, I think we also should. Yeah, that's what we can see on the map now. So there was some kind of a research, so that you can see how many hits were.
Well, that they're trying to give an indication. I think when you look at the images, obviously you can tell there's a destruction, but when you look at Twitter and the map, a rough map put together by Human Rights Watch, I believe, or at least by some of the people working for them, by Olaf there, giving an indication of how wide of an area was hit, and that this was a densely populated civilian areas, including the market, like we just heard, and that just how worrying that is in a major city. Now, one thing we really want to bring attention to is, unfortunately, violence has become a very common aspect of the Ukrainian crisis. But having such a major city still controlled by the Ukrainians struck by rockets, especially in the center, that is very unusual. That's very changing. And having it at a time when, people are hoping that negotiations would move forward, that there would be changes, very unexpected, and really seems to be a game changer. No one's quite sure what will happen next.
But beside that, there was a clear indication by the separatist leader, one of the separatist leader, Alexander Zakharchenko, who more or less on public said that they are gonna to attack Mariupol, and that would be their revenge. But that's how it happened. You can watch yourself and make your judgment on your own.
Я скажу следующее. Сегодня началось наступление на Мариуполь. Ура! Даст Бог, через пару дней мы замкнем Дебальцевский котел. И вот это, наверное, будет самым лучшим ответом и самой лучшей памятью погибших, потому что мы отомстим всем.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was also this, Zaharchenko has had different statements that have come at different times, but what he has been very clear about is ramping up the pressure and pushing for a new offensive. One of the questions we put out on Twitter was asking people who they thought was to blame for the attack on Mariupol in eastern Ukraine. Now, we asked that because even if the separatists are implicated, even that, people will get frustrated, though in this particular case, the OSCE and their preliminary report said that the rockets came from separatist-controlled territory. But we put out this question asking them who they thought was at fault. So we had one response, and maybe, Natalia, you could put it up there, from Hetman Andriy, who I think we've had before. And he says the Russian army is to blame.
Oh, okay.
If you just look in Slack, I think it should be on air. We have that. So Hetman Andriy, says the Russian army. And this is one of the issues that's there. To what extent can you separate the separatists from the Russian army? President Poroshenko, recently said there were up to or over 9,000 Russian soldiers currently in eastern Ukraine being there. So a lot of people here attribute it directly to the Russian army and not even to their proxies.
So, but beside that, what is our question so far is what will happen next, because it's more or less a collapse of the ceasefire, and it might sometimes sounds complicated, but that is the map. We see that there are constant attacks on different regions near Donetsk, near Luhansk, but also at this area near the town of Debaltsevo, which is and we have on a daily basis some reports on the casualties. So the question today is if it would be the further assault or not. And maybe for that we also are ready to talk about Donetsk, how were the things there, because last week we were all discussing the Donetsk airport. It's more or less destroyed. There is nothing in place there. It doesn't exist as well.
Maybe we could show a brief video again. I mean, what's also been spoken about was this rocket attack on a bus in Donetsk, which killed 8 people and wounded 13. So unfortunately, the violence hasn't been limited to Mariupol. It's been prevalent in many different areas. And that's one of the things we also want to look at, but I think Natalia's ready to introduce our next guest, probably. And
we're calling to Oliver Carroll, our colleague, who is a correspondent for The Independent and Politica, and spent more than the last week exactly in Donetsk, had listened to some of the press conferences of the separatist leaders, but also talked to the different people. So what is the feeling there, and what people anticipate there? We are gonna, Hi Oliver, thanks a lot for joining us. So let us know what's happening now in Donetsk. What are the expectations? What are the feelings?
Well, for the past, I've been here for nearly 2 weeks now. It's been a long time. And certainly the last few days have been among the quietest they've been, with the exception, of course, of the trolleybus explosion on Thursday. But at the same time, this is part of a general pattern. When you hear the sounds going down, it usually means that the sides are taking heed, they're assessing, they're searching out, they're doing reconnaissance, and it usually precedes something a lot louder. So there is a sense among people here, although there's more people out in the streets these days, since compared to the sort of the heyday of the height of the airport battle, which was last Saturday and Sunday. There is a sense that perhaps this won't last for too long, and even today, the shelling has kind of started again. I can't quite tell where it's coming from, but we do know that even though, I think we should say that even though in the centre it's been quite quiet, around the edges, certainly Petrovsky region, but less so around the airports, they've been shelling. Today, one of the hospitals in Oktyabrski settlement, which is the settlement between the airport and the train station, was hit. But generally speaking, the picture is a lot calmer here. And I think that generally, from what I understand of other sort of hotspots around the region, that seems to be the case as well. Now, of course, battles are ongoing in Debaltsevo, which is an important transport hub. And it seems that, between Debaltseve and Gorlovka and on the one side and towards Stakhanov and Bryanka on the other, that there's a lot of fighting going on.
Now, Oliver,
you were... General picture...
I just wanted to ask, you were at the scene of the trolley bus shelling, as you mentioned on Thursday. I mean, what was the mood there, and afterwards, how was that received by people?
Well, I was at the scene a little bit later. It was 3 hours after the event. I couldn't get to there immediately. But obviously the scene was pretty horrific. By that time, the trolley bus had been taken away. The trolley bus was in the depot in a central street. We went to see the trolley bus later and saw these old ladies clearing up glass and all kinds of gruesome. And it was not a particularly pleasant sight. And just speaking to the women there who were earning next to nothing and symbolic wages, doing an appalling job, and asking us, they're saying that we're terrorists. How do they have the nerve to call us terrorists? And that's obviously, as probably on this program you've heard before, this label of terrorism in the anti-terrorism operation. This is something which really grates on the local population. It's obviously used to propaganda effect by the Russian-backed rebel forces here, but it's a very unfortunate thing. And today, as you might have already mentioned, I haven't been listening, the Security Council says that it's going to appeal to the Hague Tribunal to declare these organisations as terrorist organisations. The potential for this being a big counterproductive measure, very counterproductive, but obviously clear from anybody to see. So.
Well, why counterproductive? What makes you say that? Because obviously, the logic behind that is, after these attacks on Mariupol, where many civilians had died, of course, Ukrainians do see that as something closer to a more traditional terrorist attack. And the bigger issue is as a war crime, really. Yeah,
it's first of all, there's the point whether they can actually do this, because it's not very clear whether Ukraine. Not having ratified the Rome Statute, and Russia on the other side not being a party to it, whether they can actually gain some appeal to the court to gain some.
So you think it's style?
It's not
style over substance that they want a large play.
It seems that way to me, and I think that the possibility of actually inflaming the situation by using the words, because we know that they have a very they're taken very badly here, and they're obviously spun by the local rebel forces. It seems to be a bit of a miscalculation, in my opinion.
And there was this so-called parade of the disgrace, where there were the Ukrainian prisoners of war, the soldiers taken to the square, and what we know as well from the news, that there were some crowd around, and what we also know that what people say that often it was created, that it has a very drastic, let's say, reaction, let's say, here in Kyiv and all around, because it was something provoking to provoke the range. But how do you see it? What was there? Did you have a chance to follow that?
I was there right at the end. The funny thing is, I was actually speaking to a Ukrainian paratrooper who was inside the airport, and he was fighting over Saturday and Sunday. And I spoke to him at various intervals during Saturday and Sunday, and saw, through his voice exactly how the battle for the airport was disintegrating from the Ukrainian side. How he saw many dead and injured who weren't being taken away, the Ukrainians couldn't get access to them, and so on and so forth. So, of course, this was happening at the same time as an official narrative that the airport was still being controlled, or that certain objects in the airport were still being controlled. In fact, that paratrooper, and his name is Yaroslav Gavrianets, is now prisoner of war, and he was part of that parade. He was right at the front. So there's a whole circle there. Obviously, there's no way anybody can condone the ritual humiliation of anybody, least of all prisoners of war, which obviously, even in an undeclared conflict, the parties have an obligations in front of the Geneva Convention, and it seems very clear that that is in breach of the Geneva Conventions.
But can you please tell us how many people approximately were there? Because what we always think, a lot of cases when you have a picture for television, and we just want to understand how it was there.
I think there were at least I think probably about 50, 100. There was a small enough. It wasn't a smallish, but it wasn't a biggish gathering. And people were very aggressive there. I was with an American photographer at the time, and they were incredibly aggressive towards him because he was taking a picture of, trying to take a picture of some of the military things around there. Just not the actual installations, but there was a vehicle there. Now, for them, they was with perhaps some justification saying, why are you targeting these vehicles?
And in the end, so
is a tragedy, and it's about how relevant and how genuine they were being. I have seen the discussions on social media. I didn't do interviews with the people. It was a delicate situation. I didn't think it was a good idea.
And when you were at the meeting with the separatist, one of the separatist leaders, Zakharchenko, there were this tough statement. He often, since the last months, he always, does a lot of threats. So it's not unusual. But what was this time? And because for us the main question is what is next? What do we expect? Is something new?
Well, it's fairly obvious the rhetoric has completely changed. It's fairly obvious that the whole premise of the peace process and the Minsk agreements for the Russian-backed rebel forces are not relevant. They have said, in fact, Zakharchenko during his meeting with the students said just that much. The political agreements are all off. He said there will be no more troop rotations. There will be no more ceasefires. The only thing we might do is prisoner exchange. By the evening, he was already saying that they will take no prisoners. In my opinion, I would take that with a bit of a pinch of salt, because I think that prisoners are still very valuable commodities in war. And I think what that was connected to was less a desire not to take prisoners, but more a desire to scare Ukrainian soldiers in front of a new wave of mobilization. I think we've seen it actually on both sides to a certain extent, a desire to, certainly, for example, through the Ukrainian irregular battalions, through there was a desire to sort of to scare the opposition, to scare the enemy, to play the battalions like Aidar. And on the other side, of course, there's been a lot of examples of that on the rebel side.
Okay, thanks a lot, Oliver. All the best for you in Donetsk. So that was our colleague, the British journalist working there, which is give a bit of information for us, because what we know as well, there was this major the trolley bus explosion, which both sides are claiming that they haven't done that. The Ukrainian military says that it's way too far from the area where they are fighting, and let's see. But what would be my take? What we talked as well with the people in Donetsk, and they were really, there was this video proliferated all around, and we've seen for what is done. Is it for just to create this escalation? For what is it for creating more, problems and conflicts between the people here, as this conflict is running, between the people in Kyiv, between the people in Donbass, playing this game?
Well, I mean, it creates a lot of bad blood, obviously. You can't have those sorts of attacks and having civilians die without people becoming very embittered. And there's really no going back from that.
I mean, that's something to be very sensitive in the way, no going way back, because there is always the issue of reconciliation, and that's what is special about this week, which had happened that still a month ago, it was already, you know, when you work on the ground, you always see that there are so many common things, and unless the shelling, unless the, you know, the military are there, unless there are the Grad rockets, the people can find the common language, because there is no, beside that, you can't find what is actually the source of the trouble.
And people always surprise you because, I mean, we're used to these cliches talking about Ukraine, about West versus East, Russian-speaking versus Ukrainian-speaking, but then it happens that you find people who are, you know, the complete reverse of what you'd expect in a different place. And I think you had a great video of something like that.
That's something, the story we would also like to, not just to show, because it's always, because that was an issue with the divisions, you know, the things which are divisive, you know, like the hatred, the conflict, it's always in the media. It's rarely that something else is there. But at the same time, while reporting and working on the Luhansk, near Luhansk area, which is closer to Russian border on the east, we met this Ukrainian officer who used to be a policeman and was staying at the Maidan during the protests at the Maidan at the other side than the protesters, and then when the Russian aggression was very obvious, he joined the army.
As an ethnic Russian who had worked in the police on Maidan,
Yeah, and an ethnic Russian working in the police on Maidan, joined the Ukrainian army, being in the prisoner at the Ilovaisk tragedy, having a Russian father, having troubles with that, but we can, just having a bit of feeling that this war and this conflict and the whole situation, we can speak about the geopolitics, but particular lives of the particular people who are changing because of that.
Я понял, что родина — это там, где ты живешь, а не там, где ты родился. Хотя по национальности я русский, отец русский, мать русская.
Что отец делал у тебя?
Отец в России живет. Ну, я не хочу на эту тему говорить. С отцом я не общаюсь. Вот как раз, когда это все началось. У нас очень плохие отношения стали. Благодаря пропаганде российской. Ну, фраза, которая меня убила. Я говорю отцу: пап, я там был, то есть там реально стоят российские солдаты. Все. Они воюют против нас. А отец говорит: и что, ты стрелял в российского солдата? То есть не слава богу, сынок, ты жив, здоров, все хорошо. Это вот очень тяжело. Ну дай бог, как говорил Тарас Григорьевич Шевченко, боритесь и поборете. Все будет хорошо.
So our team is working to let you know a bit more than usual, to have a deeper understanding of what's happening and what is behind the geopolitics as well. So besides that story, you can watch it online, you can watch the full report, but we also propose you, for instance, to watch our other reports from the ground, like that file that the couple of reports we've filmed in Donetsk about how this is what it feels like to be trapped in a war-torn eastern Ukraine, showing the stories of the people, old people, pensioners, young mothers who are trapped by this war with their kids, and how the war affects. So you can watch that going to our brand new webpage, en.hromadske.tv.
Now we want to take a step back from the personal and look at things and how they've been proceeding on the international level. As many people are aware, this week there was the World Economic Forum in Davos, and we have an exclusive interview with Bildt, the former Swedish foreign minister, just to give us some ideas into how foreign ministers are viewing this, in particular with the EU. EU foreign ministers recently had an important meeting discussing whether or not to continue sanctions against Russia. They decided it wasn't a time to repeal them. But now we want to show you that interview with him to share a little bit of the insight he gained from his former colleagues and also from Davos.
The brutal fact is, of course, that there's a lot of things that needs to be done, and that it will take its time until you see the full effects of them. It is one of the sort of most misgoverned places of the entire Soviet space, at least the European part of that, during the last 25 years. And accordingly, the anti-corruption, to make certain that you have a state structure that works, getting rid of a lot of sort of bad subsidies that are there in the economy. This is going to take a couple of years for these reforms to translate into truly new Ukraine.
Mr. Klimkin, the Ukrainian foreign minister, just has said that keeping the current pressure which is there is just not enough. There should be something else. If we speak about Russia, would you share that, and what is your idea about the future EU policy?
Well, if we talk about measures against Russia, keeping the present measures in place will have a cumulative greater and greater effect. When you implement these sorts of things, they have virtually no effect day 2 or day 3 or day 4. But day 100 and day 300 and day 500, then it's really when they start to bite. And of course what we see in Russia is the effect of falling oil prices. We see the effect also, which were coming anyhow, the absence of structural reforms in the Russian economy, so there would have been a slowdown anyhow. So I think staying the course is the name of the game when it comes to Russia, and then being even more active and supporting Ukraine.
This week there were some talks about not lifting the sanction, but some kind of softer policy by some of the EU members. Do you think it is serious, and what also not can be done, but according to your feeling, how strong is this, let's say, sentiment in some of the European countries, and how will it have any influence? Coming with also with all these leaks with the policy of Federica Mogherini.
Well, I think in view of or seeing what happened in Donbass, that particular sentiment disappeared almost entirely. And what came out of the meeting of the EU foreign ministers on Monday was a fairly strong position, saying they stay in place. But also saying, which I think is right, if the Kremlin were to truly go back and implement the Minsk agreement in full to the letter, then of course there might be a scaling back of the sanctions, but we don't see any signs of that at all.
So there are questions we have asked our audience. Are sanctions enough to stop Russian aggression in Ukraine? And have few answers from our viewers. So Andrei Hetman said that it's not enough. To beat Putin, Ukraine must liberate all occupied regions from Donbass and Crimea. While another Twitter user, Benjamin Birdsey, said that there should be negotiation on devastating sanctions, block visa, MC or SWIFT. So that is an idea. And while coming back to Davos, to the World Economic Forum, I should say that there were more discussion about the economy and the reforms from the Ukrainian side. There was pretty large delegation from Ukraine, including the Ukrainian finance minister, the economy minister, the foreign minister, the president, and they were speaking about what their reforms they are doing. And
then President Poroshenko had a highly featured speech. You know, he gave an impassioned speech to people who were there at Davos. He held a piece of the bus from Volnovakha that was hit by Grad rockets, and was really trying to connect or get his message across.
But to know more about that, we are calling to Warsaw to Sylvie Kauffmann, who is a editorial director of Le Monde, of the French paper, former editor-in-chief of Le Monde, and she writes all the time about Ukraine, about Russia, being focused in this region as well. But what we know as well, that Sylvie had an interview with the Ukrainian president. Besides, he had a chance to chat with the French president, and also he has asked few questions from the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde. So so we hope from her to know a bit more from what is the insight. Has something changed in these escalations in the attack of Mariupol? Is any will to do something else by the foreign community?
Maybe to start specifically, if we have Sylvie on the line, just how was President Poroshenko's speech received, and interviewing him, what was his tone there in Davos?
So,
if we...
Yes.
So I wonder if we can hear Sylvie? Yeah, okay. Sylvie, thank you so much for joining us, flying right after Davos. So the first question is really, you had a chance to see all these world leaders there. Are there any news because of the escalation? What are they going to do? What we can expect from France, from other countries? Whether any really strong talks on Ukraine at the forum?
Well, I think, of course, Davos was finished before or just as the attack on Mariupol started, so there were no reactions to that in Davos. It was too early. But what we can say is that there's a sense now, I think, there's a shift in the mood of Western leaders. If you remember earlier this year, we started the year with discussions within the EU about whether we should lift the sanctions. And a paper that Special Representative for Foreign Policy of European Union, Federica Mogherini, had prepared for the European leaders to work on, which was a paper to discuss how the EU could be more open to Russia, could have more dialogue with Russia. I think now the mood has shifted in that sense that Western leaders now realize that there is a real possibility of a war, of a full-scale war. This is a word which is now being used in their discussions, and so you saw that President Obama in India made a very strong statement about whether it would be possible to ratchet the pressure, as he said, on Russia. He very, very squarely put the blame on Russia for these actions in Mariupol. So, and he said, I think that's his exact sentence. I'm checking on my notes. I will look at additional options that are available to us short of military confrontation and try to address this issue. So Obama being very serious and forceful on this. On the EU side, as you know, it's always slower. It takes 28 people to decide. So Mrs. Mogherini has called for an extraordinary meeting of Foreign Affairs Minister on Thursday. So you in Ukraine may, of course, ask why Thursday, why not earlier? I think Donald Tusk provided the answer, the Polish former Prime Minister, who is now the President of the European Council. And he made it known that, to have, for instance, an urgent meeting already tomorrow would be taking the risk to have just a condemnation statement from the foreign ministers, which would be too weak. And the way the European Union works is that they need a couple of more days to be able to put up together a reaction, a stronger reaction, which is really, I think, what they are going to discuss.
Do you think that this Normandy forum, including the Germans and the French, is something is a part of the solution? Are the talks still about that? Because more or less it's not working, and we're now seeing that this ceasefire collapse and the idea of Minsk as something which would put in place the real peace plan with the closure of the sealing of the Russian-Ukrainian border will work. So what is your take on the Normandy format?
Well, it was still, the Normandy format was still seen as a possibility and a serious option earlier this week. I mean, they had a meeting of foreign minister of the Normandy format on Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, which apparently made a few progress. I don't know exactly which progress, but I'm not sure whether this is still possible or whether it's still a workable format, and whether the Minsk agreement is still a serious option. I mean, obviously the big problem, the big issue, why wasn't the Minsk memorandum being implemented? Because there was disagreement on the line of demarcation that was agreed in Minsk. Well, obviously now it looks like we are beyond this issue of the line.
Well, and just a bit of a different question, if I could ask you, you know, back to Davos. I was curious how, you know, Russia and Ukraine were received there. I mean, in particular, how Poroshenko's speech was received, but there was also these comments by a Russian deputy prime minister, I believe, who talked about how Russians would be happy to eat less for Putin. I mean, how were all of these kind of overtures and statements received by people there?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear you. What was the question?
We talk about the Poroshenko and the Russian commentaries by the Igor Shuvalov, how it was all received.
Well, there was, from the way I saw it personally, and I think I was not the only one, there was a real disconnect between the Ukrainian the way the Ukrainian presented themselves in Davos. You know, you had your finance minister, economy minister, the president Poroshenko was there. I mean, there was a lot of Ukrainian lobbying, if I may say, but it was normal kind of Davos lobbying about the action of the government and the prospect of economic reforms and the help you needed and all this. The Russians were more low-key than they were in the previous years. And I think you could see that they were isolated. And there was this panel where Mr. Shuvalov got really angry. He got really, you know, he had an outburst of criticism about Gorbachev, about the fact that Gorbachev, with all the reforms and the liberties that he introduced in the Soviet Union, in fact, introduced a lot of grief and pain to the Russian people. So then there was the former finance minister Alexei Kudrin, who was there and who reacted very strongly, saying, "I totally disagree with you about Gorbachev." You know, and there we were seeing these Russian leaders or figures arguing about the legacy of Russian history and Catherine the Great and Gorbachev, and it all seemed a little bit surrealistic. But what was really clear was that their economy is in a bad situation and that they are extremely worried about this.
Sylvie, you had a chance to interview the Ukrainian president. What was new for you? What was your take on this interview?
Well, there were two things, I think. One was that he was trying to open, what struck me was that he was really trying to keep the door of dialogue open. He was, of course, quite frank or quite determined to show that there was a Russian aggression and that there were a lot of new Russian troops coming into Ukraine. But he was being careful, in my opinion, not to be too overcritical of Mr. Putin himself, you know, as a leader, as a person. He didn't fall into the trap of saying really bad things, very negative things about Putin. And you could see that he wanted to keep this door open. And he said the sanctions are important also because they keep the Russians at the table of negotiations. The other thing which struck me is that he talked about the army, the Ukrainian army, saying, you know, how now Ukraine at last has an army. He said, when I arrived in power in June, there was no army. Now we have an army which is trained and equipped. And, you know, for me, this is a little bit difficult to believe because I'm not sure this is what we are seeing. So I was a bit surprised by this.
And finally, you had made also an interview with the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, and the question also we are asking, so would there be any payment, any support, and how the escalation of the conflict influence on it? We speaking about the IMF support towards Ukraine.
The interview will be published tomorrow in Le Monde, so I can't give you too many details, but she didn't go into details about figures. But she said that, of course, there was a big problem about Ukraine, which was the link between the military situation and the economic situation. And she said, of course, the economy, it's very difficult to fix the economy if you still have that kind of instability on your borders. So that was one fact that she mentioned. Otherwise, she said, this is really a pity because we finally have the impression of a government team which is determined to finally carry out reforms. And then she mentioned that she referred to your finance minister and to your governor of the central bank. And she said, we have a team there in Kyiv which seems really determined to make reforms, which hasn't been the case in the last 20 years. That's what she said.
Okay, thanks so much, Sylvie. We are looking forward to read your article tomorrow in Le Monde, the interview with the IMF head, and we're very grateful to Sylvie Kauffmann, the editorial director of Le Monde, for all this insight. As we also want to bring you attention here at this studio at the Hromadske International. We had also a cooperation with the World Economic Forum and also the Shaping Davos team while discussing the new way of running politics with the Ukrainian young leaders from the civil society, from the politics, from media. It was named Rethinking Government. There was a discussion, and we also would be happy that you watch it and to know more about that with this joint project. And already now I'd like to also present Taras Kachka, who is the Vice President of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. But besides the lawyer and the economist, who was the one working in the team who had written the EU agreement, more or less, worked for many years there and just coming from Davos as well. So we want to bring this perspective as well, not just about the war, but what is real about the business, about the investment, about how Ukraine was seen there.
Yeah. So I think that I could agree with Sylvie, about that.
I saw you nodding your head in agreement with some of the things she said.
Yeah, she said that I think that the perception of statements of our ministers from economic bloc was really, that with some reservations, but rather positive, because of course we still have a lot of promises, not exact reforms, but certain element of these reforms are already implemented, and of course we can, that the decisions on fiscal reforms in the end of last year, so that was immediately before the new year, some of them have been really controversially assessed by big business, especially in particular spheres, but certain elements introduced in tax code were absolutely, in favor of business. So we still have, certain elements are really reformistic, other elements can be justified by difficult situation in public finances, but I think that now we see that we are moving towards real reforms. So of course not in the best way, but it would be really naive to anticipate that or to predict that we will have, that the process of reform in the way as it is now presented by Slovak reformers or Polish reformers or Estonian ones.
What is your take on that? Because there are a lot of complaints that there hasn't been a big hard reform yet in Ukraine, that you've had little things or you've had talks about things. And I mean, that's something I myself have worried about. And other people have said, no, you have to see the culture. The culture has changed because now the government is trying to listen to people, trying to listen to experts and bring people in. I mean, is that your impression? Will there be something big?
I think, yeah, I might say that, of course, now representing business in Ukraine, I might say that the reforms are still not good enough, or the process of reforming is not good, and quite often we oppose in the initiatives of the government, because a government is trying to not to reform but to fix really technical current problems. It's a mixed firefighting, because they firefighting one problem, we firefighting the way how government tries to fix the problem.
Issue, right?
But at the same time, especially in energy, I think, but at the same time we see that in strategic perspective, in certain spheres we already have adopted positive legislation which is signed and now on the level of implementation. In other spheres we have a legislation adopted at first reading, for example, for judicial reform. In other spheres we have a really common understanding of strategies, and I hope that we will see that the laws will be adopted. But in any case, I think that the crucial element, and especially when we are talking, for example, about fiscal amendments introduced before the new year, I turn back to it because it was underlined by Minister of Finance. She said that please take a serious look at what we introduced. And I might say that the success of this reform is totally depends on the way how it will be implemented by Ukrainian fiscal authorities, and in this particular case. And here I think that the biggest skepticism lies, because for the moment business still does not trust to the authorities, especially local level, especially implementing authorities.
Well, but has your optimism or faith increased, with the appointment of the new finance minister, with Hromadske? I mean, I assume you know each other well, or
yes,
in the same circle?
Of course, she has a very specific task for the moment, of course, and I think that
she has a very specific task. Is that to get the IMF
it's IMF, it's public debt, and how to deal with public debt.
But I mean, this is, getting back to Davos, first of all, there's a very interesting article in Foreign Policy. I don't know if you saw an interview with Hromadske, with the finance minister, talking about how her sense was that Russia was trying to work to stop this loan from coming through, that it wasn't in their best interests. And then we had Sylvie, who was talking about how there is a strong Ukrainian presence at Davos trying to kind of lobby and get messages across. Is that something you sensed at all, that there a lot of pressure, a lot of moving to try and get this IMF loan, or that there's been opposition to it?
Of course, I think that now this is so. I think that we are in parallel, let's say, work pattern, because I think that we should take account that on working level there is an IMF mission. They are discussing. They already have preliminary results.
Sure.
And of course there is a strategic discussion about loans or financial support, not only from IMF, from other donors as well, from national authorities, and US Secretary of Treasury should also make certain statements in favor of Ukraine as well. So I think that we now in the big process, it was predicted that January will be really hot on discussion about financial support for Ukraine, because of course public finance crisis is the basic or core element of economic crisis. Sure. Because Ukrainian economy, I think, is strong enough by its entrepreneurial spirit, because this is the difference between Ukrainian and Russian economy, because that we have no so strong public sector or state-owned enterprises. And I think that if we will resolve this problem of public debt, if we will manage to deal with fiscal consolidation, so balance revenues and spendings during this year, I think that this is will be a good basis for successful reforms.
Do you think that's possible without default, to balance it,
with default or
without? I mean, default would be one way to renegotiate.
A lot of economists. We organized a round table in the chamber and gathering a lot of economists, and everyone saying that the situation is manageable. So it is not unmanageable. So it is not fiction to say that we will do it. Of course, the situation is manageable. There are different ways how to deal with the problem of public finances, how to how to let's say reshuffle all these debt obligations Ukraine has. And I think that second couple of next weeks will show that which way the situation will develop. But in any case, I hope that the situation in reality indeed manageable.
Taras, everybody knows about the Ukraine-EU agreement, even thought that it might be a roadmap for reforms and for changing the country. You know, the whole revolution was very much connected to it. And as a person who probably is the only person who knows it by heart that we know, what do you think, how it's implemented? What's happening to it? Is it an important document? Is it something which is moving Ukraine?
No, luckily I'm already not the only, or not the let's say a person from a very short list of persons who knows the agreement. More and more people reading it, explaining it. So this is a really good pattern of development, because with agreement of this kind, it is important not only to negotiate, but then to ensure that everyone understands and implement the agreement. I think here we should, if we are talking seriously and maybe a little bit boring, that of course we have really good developments when we are talking about trade in goods, about our change of trade patterns, because EU became a #1 trade partner for Ukraine in last year. And also, Parliament last year managed to adopt all necessary legislation for simplifying the trade between Ukraine and EU in agriculture and food products and industrial products as well. But I think that this is only, that the first big steps, showing that there is a big interest and big will to implement the agreement. But the story only begin.
But what do you say to the people who said that it's more or less a paper and there is no really strong will to do that on the different levels of the government?
Of course, it is not so. It is not so big.
Are you disappointed or are you satisfied?
I'm just saying that things are going in the way it should go, because it would be really naive to anticipate with Komsomol enthusiasm that we will implement everything in 1 year and everyone is working without any rest on implementing all in every small detail. But at the same time, we see no repetition of the story with PCA agreement, the agreement we already, so the agreement which will be replaced by association agreement, which was negotiated in 1994 and was forgotten by everyone, both by Ukrainian and the EU side as well. It was only taken, from dust when it was the certain trade conflicts appeared. So I think that now this story is totally different, but at the same time, I think that it will be really big problem or misunderstanding if we will limit reforms, all necessary reforms, only to the agreement, to the association agreement. Of course, association agreement prescribes a lot of reforms in transport, in energy, and now, for example, I think that very soon government will submit a law on natural gas to the parliament, and parliament will adopt it. It will be implementation of association agreement and our energy community obligations. But at the same time, all these things connected with fiscal consolidation, with balancing revenues and expenditures, social policy, are a little bit beyond what is written in the agreement.
Still necessary. And I guess this will probably be the last question for me. But if there was one reform you could make happen now, no matter how difficult, what would it be? What would be the one reform you'd really want to see in Ukraine?
I think this year it will be. If we should talk about a reform which is called usually fiscal consolidation. It's a mix of reform in revenue part and fiscal part, because after all, we need to fix all leftovers and to clear out our tax code. Of course, the certain elements already have been introduced, but it is really difficult to say that it was comprehensive and full-fledged tax reform.
But why that reform? Because only that will get the economy going, or fix revenue for the government?
I think that the problem with this reform is that we are trying to fix a lot of problems at the same time. So of course that we might understand the short-term priorities of government in dealing with public debt. And on the second half, we should do our, let's say, must exercise with our expenditures, with deficit, with Naftogaz, with pension fund, with social funds, and so on. So we already saw certain attempts with decreasing our social tax, but the attempt was is not really successful without any further reforms in our pension system, in the specific pension system, in pension age and other things which seriously influence on our expenditure side of our budget. So all this exercise, called usually fiscal consolidation, should be #1 priority for this year.
Taras, today we have asked the question from our audience, are sanctions enough to stop Russian aggression in Ukraine? While there was a person named Benjamin Birdsey who said that there should be negotiation on blocking Visa, MC or SWIFT regarding Russia. So there was another question. Do you think, I mean, just theoretically, like, is SWIFT action, is it possible? And if it is, the question is, so more or less, can it work? That SWIFT action, would it be possible, you know, is it implemented?
In theory, it is possible. In reality, it will be just, you know, cutting totally the big part of the globe from the financial market, not only from credits, but also from day-to-day operation. I don't think that this is feasible and this is a solution people are looking for, because sanctions should not be the really building an economic wall between Russia and the rest of the world, because after all, in any case, I think in the recent future, when we will have a peaceful relations with Russia, Russia will remain one of key market for Ukrainian export as well, as the same as for the EU, for US, and other states, because nobody wants to kill or just, you know, to delete Russia from the globe. This is, I think, the part of politics towards peaceful solution and coming back to peaceful neighboring and prosperous trade between each other and investing into each other. Therefore, I don't think that we should use such measures. I think that we can compare them to the, you know, nuclear weapon. You know, if you cut SWIFT, or it means that you cut any relations with the market.
Thank you, Taras. Thanks a lot for your insight and for the explanation about the EU agreement, and not just that. And I should say as well that the next week we are waiting here in the studio for the new Minister of Economy. He has promised to come and answer our questions here. So, and thanks a lot for you.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you for joining us. And you were going to mention the webpage?
I'm going to mention the webpage, because we have the, besides Twitter, Facebook and everything, Hromadske International has a webpage. It's en.hromadske.tv, where you can see and watch all our reports, all our Medium files, everything which is there, all our stories written all together in the same place. And we really ask you to share it, to know more about Ukraine and the region.
And that's where you can find all of our videos from today. In addition to our explainers, it all comes together. All right, that's all for our show today. Please join us again next week for another edition of The Sunday Show.